which means do what you want and don't think about how it may affect others. It is also a culture that doesn't value friendships and tells thin stories about boys, men, humans, and our culture as reflected in our modern definitions of manhood, maturity, and success, with their emphasis on the stereotypically hard sides of ourselves and their mocking of our stereotypically soft sides. One of the best known of these types of stories is that bad behavior among boys and men is inevitable, as boys will be boys, suggesting that their actions reflect their biology rather than a culture that promotes violence, or at least doesn't do much to prevent it. The danger of this story is that if we think it's biology, we don't think we can change it, and thus we don't try. But if we understand that their behavior is a product of a culture that values the so-called masculine sides of ourselves over the so-called feminine sides, we can prevent the violence that stems from such a culture by valuing both sides of our humanity, and thus join the rebels whose cause is the focus of this book. My aim in sharing what boys and young men have taught me about them and about us is to reveal the nature of their and our problems and the solutions. They teach us about who we are as humans and how the culture we have created for them gets in the way and leads to a crisis of connection, as suggested by rising rates of depression, anxiety, loneliness, and suicide, as well as partisan divides, hate crimes, and mass violence. They also teach us about the solutions to the crisis that are rooted in our nature, but that aren't reflected in our culture. Not only do their thick stories open our eyes to see the elephant in the room, they also empower and humanize them and us, and repair our broken dignity, as argued by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie, by reminding us that our future is not in the hands of fate or artificial intelligence, but in us, humans, who already know naturally how to create a world in which we listen, care, and take individual and collective responsibility. 1. From the time I was a child, I have had a type of double consciousness, and thus have understood that there are at least two stories to everything and everyone. The first story, the one that most people share, is considered common knowledge. The second story, the one less often shared, is more difficult to hear given the volume of the first one. We need to listen more closely and with curiosity to hear the second story. We can think of the first story as analogous to a tree as a young child would draw it, with roots, a trunk, branches, and leaves. It's not necessarily false, but it represents nothing more than the image of a tree. The second story reflects more than just its image. It considers where the tree grows, how it nourishes other trees around it, what types of diseases kill it, and why trees are necessary for human survival. I've always been fascinated by why we are more likely to tell the first type of story rather than the second. Thin stories, or the first type, are not inert. Rather, they work as culturally dominant forces, determining how we live, think, feel, and behave. They provide the model by which we raise and educate our children, treat one another, and act at home, in school, and in the workplace. They determine what our goals and aspirations are and how we interact with technology and the natural world around us. They form our ideas about what it means to be a boy, a girl, a man, a woman, an adult, and a human, and what it means to develop over time. Those of us living in Western society have been telling thin stories for centuries, guided by the philosophies of Descartes, Locke, Hobbes, and Rousseau. These stories split reason from emotion, give human capacities and desires a gender in their references to quote-unquote man, make culture into nature, and have no heart. In these distinctly European stories told by white and economically privileged men, the men are separated from the women and children, thinking is separated from feeling, the self from the other, the mind from the body, and nature